Thank you very much. We're very pleased today to welcome Alyssa Banford Witting, who is an associate professor in the School of Family Life, especially in the Marriage and Family Therapy program here at BYU. She graduated with a degree in Marriage, Family, and Human Development from BYU in 2007, then has a master's in Marriage and Family Therapy from Auburn, and a PhD also in Marriage and Family Therapy from Texas Tech University. Prior to coming to BYU, she taught, if I'm reading that right, in San Diego, and this is now her second year that she has been here at BYU. Her research interests broadly encompass processes and resources which sustain trauma symptoms as well as aid rehabilitation in trauma-affected populations. And this is what she's going to be talking to us about today, as you can see, with especially specific concentration in Sri Lanka. We're very happy to have her here. She's a widely published scholar, and please join me in welcoming her to the Kennedy Center Lecture Series.
Thank you. It's good to be here today. So you have a theme of women in politics, and this is maybe a little bit of an indirect kind of topic, but you will be hearing about women in a very specific context that relates to political tensions, political forces that have sort of resulted in traumatic events, which is the area of study that's most interesting to me. Okay, so let me just familiarize you a little bit with the context we're going to be talking about. Are any of you familiar with where Sri Lanka is? Probably actually several of you are, okay. So it's a little island nation right off the coast of India, and it's about the size of New Jersey. We've got somebody pointing to the map over there. It's a little country. It's actually, if you put your two fingers on a globe, you can't really get further away from Provo than Colombo, Sri Lanka. It's like right opposite side of the world. So there's a really rich history and context in Sri Lanka, and I want to point out a couple of things about the culture and sort of explain why me, why am I involved in research in this area. So there's what you're looking at with this particular map is a little divide that is representing ethnic and religious separation in the country. So in the western side, you have mostly people who are of the Sinhalese ethnicity, and that's the language that they speak, and they're primarily Buddhist. And then over on the eastern and northern part of the country, individuals are primarily of the Tamil ethnicity, and a lot of them practice Hindu, and there's a few Christians kind of spread throughout the country. But this divide kind of comes about from an interesting history. Sri Lanka has a long history of colonial occupation with the Netherlands, Portugal, and then Great Britain that did not end until the mid-1970s. Up until that time, the nation was known as Ceylon. It's now Sri Lanka. So what happened during that time is one of the few exports that Sri Lanka has is tea, and there are a lot of tea plantations there. And while the British were occupying Sri Lanka, they brought down Tamil individuals from southern India to run the tea plantations. So as a result of this, you have this big Tamil population in the country. And after the colonial occupation ended, there was some ethnic tensions between the two groups that arose over generations of coexisting in different economic conditions because of that occupation. And that eventually erupted and came to a head in 1983 with a militant Tamil separatist group called the LTTE, or the Tamil Tigers. And this erupted into a civil war conflict that lasted over 25 years. So from 1983 until 2009. Then right at the tail end of that conflict in 2004, many of you are probably familiar with the fact that an enormous tsunami hit in the Indian Ocean and caused a tsunami wave that killed over 200,000 people throughout Southeast Asia, and Sri Lanka was hit very heavily by that. Primarily like in this whole region, all just around this whole side of the coast. So you have a really interesting kind of trauma-embedded context that happens here. And the demographic change that most interests me about this is that there was a big surge in the widow population as a result of both the war and the tsunami. And they're quite vulnerable in terms of dealing with mental health distress, which has been a lot of what my research is about, understanding that distress. So why am I connected to this? I'm telling you this part of it, why I'm connected, because it comes up later in terms of thinking about your own position to the research that interests you. I got involved in this because I went to Auburn and I had my thesis chair there as a master's student is Sri Lankan and has since gone back there and was living in the country for a while and now is back in the US. But he provided me with some data from women that were disaster affected, and the idea of a big natural disaster really sort of interested me in terms of trauma studies. So I got working with this data, and when I got my first faculty appointment in San Diego, he invited me to come and do a study there. And so I went in 2014 and then again in 2016 with a small grant to study the distress, the psychological distress that was there. As a therapist, that really interests me. So I want you to remember that, like my position, how I got into this, it was kind of a matter of following opportunities. And I really didn't know very much about this context until I started researching it. And that has some implications for who I am in the research context. I'll talk about that later on. Okay, so now that I've given you a little bit of backdrop of the country, I'm going to tell you what I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to tell you a little bit about two recent studies that my colleagues and I have put together out of our most recent data collection, which was now 3 years ago. It's hard to believe. So these are some pictures from that study. We were there January 2016. This is me and my colleague Jessica Lambert. And these are our 5 fantastic research assistants that accompanied us and spoke the local language and helped us with interviews with widowed women. So let me just give you a really brief overview of the methods of this study. We went to the eastern part of the country. We spent most of our time here. We were there for about 3 weeks, and we recruited a sample of 400 women who are Tamil and widowed for a variety of reasons, but about a little over a quarter of them were widowed in either the war or the tsunami. And so we had a battery of assessments for them about psychological distress, about their community, about stigma that they experienced, which I'll talk about in a minute. And we looked at just what was going on with how they were feeling in terms of depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress symptoms, and that kind of thing. So I'm going to tell you about the findings of 2 research studies that came from that project. Okay, so like I mentioned, there's a lot of distress in the context, and I'll give you some figures on that a little bit further on. But I wanted to kind of introduce you to kind of the theory or the concept that we're coming from in studying this distress. The question is, where does the distress come from, and ultimately, what can we do to ameliorate it? 2 big theory and conceptual principles kind of guided our work in this area. One is stigma, and the other one is loss. So stigma is really a present factor for women in many parts of the world. And Sri Lanka and many countries in Southeast Asia are no different, particularly when you're talking about single women heading households or widowed women. I'll talk a little bit about some of the specifics of that in a minute, but in general, there was a recent report that came out from the UN that studied sort of the social status of widows in some Southeast Asian countries and kind of concluded that and referred to them as unwanted insiders. So they're part of the community, but sort of demoted as citizens in many ways. They have lesser access to things like remarriage, social connections, participation in community events, and they suffer risks as well that I'll talk about in a minute. So stigma is this general idea that there's kind of a social force that is blocking you from a resource of some kind. So we really were interested in zeroing in on stigma and socially related problems as a driver of some of the distress we were seeing in this trauma context. Then I'm also really interested in loss. I've started writing a lot of my work on trauma from a loss perspective, specifically this theory called the conservation of resources. All it basically says is that what makes an event stressful is that you lose something. And resources are really important to protect us from distress, and when we lose resources or they're threatened, then we will be distressed. And so the point is that stress is therefore a reaction to some kind of loss. And so I've been really interested in studying post-mass trauma context to look for what is it that people have lost. Because it seems to be that a lot of what maintains trauma symptoms and other forms of psychological distress is what you lose, more than maybe the gravity of an event in a single point in time. So those are kind of the overlay that these studies come from. Let me tell you just a little bit more about what stigma looks like, specifically for the women in Sri Lanka. There's a lot of variability here. Not every woman who's widowed in Sri Lanka would experience this, but this is some of the patterns that we see in the literature. So this first one is this triple burden idea. So there's three sorts of general threats that women in developing countries may experience when they are widowed or single. And one is just holding the widowhood label. Many women go so far as to lie to their children and family members about being widowed and will just suggest that the husband has gone somewhere else because the label carries a lot of stigma. You're not necessarily eligible to remarry, not necessarily because there's any sort of rule or law preventing you from doing that, but there's a lot of understanding that if I have children and I remarry someone, they may actually be really terrible to my children, and so in the interest of protecting them, I can't do that. And that was a study by Jennifer Hindman in 2008 kind of laid out that it's kind of an illusion of choice to remarry and to regain some social status. There's also a limited access to resources financially. The women that we talked to in our study, that was a big theme and the findings that I'll describe to you a little bit later, but it becomes really, really difficult financially when you're on your own. And the last one is sexual vulnerability. Women who are single or widowed are just far more vulnerable to sexual attacks, but also sexual accusations. Some of the cutoff from society that the women in our sample experienced was because of a general sense that widowed or single women are threatening to existing family units, that they're promiscuous and could come in and wreck your home, not to be trusted. And so they carry a label of kind of dangerous to the community. There's a couple different forms of stigma that we sort of conceptualized in our study. One would be more external. Examples of this would be violence that you might experience, limited resources and mobility. That could be your physical mobility in the country or your social mobility. Being isolated, insulted, marginalized, or not belonging in the community, and troubles with gaining access to employment. This was, again, really variable by region in the country. It's not as challenging for all women in all regions of Sri Lanka itself. There's some variability. And then there's also internal stigma, the idea that these things that I experience, these messages in society about who I am and my status, can be internalized. There's a big body of research on internal stigma. It's usually talking about mental health diagnoses or maybe an illness. We applied it in our study to the status and label of widowhood, which has not actually been done before. But I'll talk to you about what we found. But it's this idea that, again, the stigma process becomes internalized. And then these I already talked about a little bit. Widowed women are sometimes considered bad omens. They're sometimes blamed for the loss of their spouse as being unlucky, promiscuous, and then I talked a little bit about remarriage already. Okay. Let me see. I don't think I skipped anything. Okay. So let me just tell you the research questions for the two studies and the findings that I'm going to describe to you. So, like I mentioned, we had a sample of 400 women that we recruited with some collaborators, local collaborators in our research team that helped us to go throughout local communities and invite women to meet at community centers on a prescribed set of days. And they would come and be interviewed and fill out a survey via interview for the study. And we were interested in this first question from that data, that it's quantitative or survey data. So we were interested in examining, okay, so we have trauma exposure. We know we have that. We have war and disaster events. We got heavy loss in the environment. We want to know how that connects to mental health distress. But we started to think about our theory and our conceptual drivers. We wanted to know, is stigma a part of that? is stigma a way that the losses and the trauma exposure is actually kind of carrying the distress or maintaining the symptoms? So we hypothesized that, if you had more trauma exposure, that you would have more distress in terms of depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress symptoms, and that also the stigma piece might be a mechanism in explaining some of that. One thing that's important to note here is that because of the timing in which we collected our data and the political context in Sri Lanka, we weren't able to really ask a full gamut of trauma-related questions. Sri Lanka is still undergoing a process of internal tribunals and court hearings for war crimes on both sides of that civil war conflict that I mentioned. And so there are certain types of events like kidnapping, rape, torture, and imprisonment of civilians that we could not ask about without potentially putting our participants in danger of retribution from one side of the conflict or another as these things are unfolding. So we had some trauma exposure, some displacement, seeing bombing, shellings, stuff like that, but it's important to know that we weren't able to ask the full context. Okay, so that's our first study. And the second study was a qualitative study. We conducted focus groups with a subset of 21 of the women in our sample, and we asked them to tell us about their lives as widows, essentially, in the context. And we wrote a recent study about what they experienced, how do they describe their losses? Again, delving more into this idea that trauma is a function of loss. And so next what I'll do is just kind of describe what we found. Okay, so a couple of things to note with this Stigma paper, that's the survey paper with the 400 women. What we found is that the distress in the sample is really, really high. So, and to give you some sense of that, about a third of the women scored above the post-traumatic stress inventory cutoff, which it's not a diagnostic tool, but that just means that they're experiencing a pretty significant level of post-traumatic stress. 80.6% of the women scored above the clinical cutoff for anxiety, and 88.2% of our sample scored above the clinical cutoff for depression. And in terms of the internalized stigma scale that we used, it had a maximum score of 4, and the average was about 2.5. So in general, this is a highly distressed sample. And again, our goal is to understand what mechanisms explain that distress so we could figure out what to do about that. So one interesting finding, it's probably easier just to show you this on the picture. Okay, this is the model we came up with. So we were interested in this trauma exposure piece and understanding, okay, so how does that relate over here to post-traumatic stress, to anxiety, to depression? We know these are high in the sample. What explains that? And we were interested in looking at this external kind of stigma and internal stigma as potential mechanisms that kind of run between the trauma exposure and the symptoms. And the interesting thing that we found, first off, was that there wasn't any correlation between trauma exposure, which was asking women to kind of add up a number of traumatic events that they had experienced in the tsunami and the war conflict. Wasn't any relationship between that and this internalized stigma. And so we wondered, well, is that because there's nothing going on there? Or is it happening through this external stigma, like I described, of being kind of cut off and marginalized from society, being an unwanted insider? So we set up this model to kind of test that. And we controlled for this variable of sense of community. And the reason we did that is in our initial kind of summary study of the whole project, we found that sense of community, or feeling like your village is a good place for you to be, and that you do have some kind of sense of belonging there, was actually quite a protective factor for the mental health distress. So we wanted to control for that before looking at how these stigma pieces kind of play a role. So what we generally found was that, in case you don't want to read every single number and interpret it, I'll give you the rundown. So higher trauma exposure, more symptoms, kind of makes sense, right? And what we also saw was more trauma exposure was also linked with greater levels of social problems. And this social problem scale was something we used as kind of a proxy for looking at stigma in the context. Meaning we asked people about difficulties with remarriage, being displaced from your home, being disconnected, or it's kind of a subjective sense of being devalued in your community, and reverse that. So the more social problems that you have, that's connected with also having more trauma exposure. And then we looked at a bunch of indirect effects, meaning does trauma affect these symptoms through these things? And what we found in general is that it does. Meaning more trauma exposure could theoretically lead to more stigma, which could lead to more stigma being internalized, or a sense of believing on the inside some of the unfortunate social discourse that happens outside of you. And the largest indirect effect we saw is this one that's circled here. It's kind of this two-part thing. So social problems, or the external kind of stigma, had an impact on depression symptoms through this internalized piece. This is interesting to me as a therapist because this is the kind of thing that we can target in clinical work. Is just explore and unpack how stigma becomes internalized, or how we make sense of the stigma experiences that we have in society. So that's generally what we found there. It kind of confirmed some of our hypotheses, and it also helped us to understand how stigma itself can be kind of a vehicle through which we lose things. So part of losing in the trauma context is experiencing stigma based on what you lost. In this case, these women lost their husbands. Okay, so our other study, let me just remind you quickly of the methods of the second half of this. So we also conducted focus group interviews with a small subset of our sample. And so we had 3 different groups meet with a total of 21 women from a range of ages, anywhere from 29 to 80, and had them just describe for us some of their daily challenges and their coping strategies. And so we went and we took this data set and we looked for everything that we could find about loss. And this is the theoretical model that we came up with using grounded theory methodology. So what we found was that there was generally kind of 3 ways in which that the women talked about loss. So we had the first, losses that were directly associated with the war or the tsunami, and I'll give you an example of some of the quotations that represent that data in a minute. So you had kind of this primary loss of traumatic events are unfolding, I lost something, which was frequently a family member. That led to contextually related losses, which had to do with a loss of selfhood and status, meaning that the women really participated in a lot of what we defined as self-sacrifice. In Sri Lanka, it's very, in many parts of the world, culturally appropriate for women in this situation who've lost a spouse to put all of their focus and attention on their children. And that's kind of a 2-part piece. In some of the feminist literature out of Sri Lanka, it talks about how that's a culturally ascribed notion that women should do that. They should focus everything on their kids and not do anything for the advancement of self. The other piece is we noticed in some other research and our own literature that was almost a way to cope with the loss. One woman spoke of being really proud of sacrificing any prospects for remarriage or trying really hard for economic advancement to take care of her kids, to make sure that they went to school, and to focus her attention on that, which led to taking a future orientation. A lot of our women talked about that the way they responded to the loss was to do everything they could to forget about it, to be really present-oriented and to live for today, and to do everything they could to support their children to have a better future. We also saw a ton of contextually or kind of cascading losses that went from the loss of spouse over to the loss of physical and financial support. This was enormous. The women talked about just really having a hard time finding sustainable income and ways to bring that in for themselves. A lot of them are just shopkeepers. A lot of them would do kind of house cleaning type work. And a lot of them experience further stigma for trying to do that, when you, we had one woman describe to us that when you put on clean clothes, pull back your hair, and kind of get washed up to go and be a houseworker in someone else's house, that someone might accuse you of prostitution, essentially, where you feel, again, more stigmatized and marginalized from kind of the mainstream community because of these accusations. And then we also saw losses relating to the environment. One of the most talked about situations that emerged from this was reduced safety in human-elephant conflict because you didn't have a partner. So where we were in Sri Lanka was pretty rural. Not all of it. We saw this most prominently in one of our focus groups in a really rural area where they did mostly farming. Elephants, the Asian elephant has its most concentrated population in Sri Lanka. And because of the forced displacement that happened all over the country during the war conflict, the migratory patterns of the elephants changed because families would leave their farms and their homes to flee for safety, and the elephants would come because there's a lot of food there and a great nutrition source. So years later, after 25 years of this conflict, when the people are coming to resettle those areas, there are elephants there now, and they're really terrified of each other on both sides. So I think it was in 2016, there was 279 elephants killed by people and something 70 or 80 people killed by elephants. So they'll come in to the community at night, and because there isn't enough money in the communities to pay for electricity to keep the city lighted, or the little village, the elephants will come in and be really quiet and will break houses down. And so we saw a few of those homes kind of knocked a little bit to the side, and the elephants will get into the house and take the food and the rice paddy that has been stored. And so this was really frightening and challenging, and the women talked about how on those occasions other men in the village might come to help get you out of the environment, but it was just compounded by the widowhood status. That danger was. So then these responses to loss. I talked a little bit about having a future orientation and forgetting. There were also some communal responses to loss that demonstrated, great resilience in the face of a lot of loss. One of which was religious participation. The women described this in a lot of different ways: attending ceremonies, going to temple, receiving blessings from local church leaders. And they also talked about receiving support from others. This was a little bit, there was a few parts to this. One was like living and moving in with relatives after you lost your spouse was kind of a necessity for a lot of people in the sample. And so they received support that way. Another way was that they briefly mentioned that they would sometimes talk to each other about their hardships, but this wasn't super acceptable. So one of the things that we picked up from the conversations that the women in our sample had with the interviewers was that it's more appropriate to talk to someone about your problems who's in a better situation than you. So you don't necessarily want to share your problems with somebody who has similar contextual problems. So they didn't talk to each other a ton about their day-to-day stresses, but they felt very free to talk with us about them because they perceived us to be in a better situation. So that was generally what we found. It kind of was in sync a little bit with our thinking theoretically about how loss works, how one loss leads to another loss, which leads to a variety of responses. And those responses are very culturally informed, very politically informed, very socially informed. So here's some examples of the three kind of categories that we found. These were examples of sort of the primary immediate losses that were directly related to the traumas, the tsunami and the war. So one woman said, "We used to live here until the tsunami came. He, meaning my husband, 2 sons and 3 grandchildren. All of these went into the sea when the tsunami came suddenly." Just kind of a brief description of how rapidly that happened. This was a quote about being displaced during the war conflict. "We lost everything when we escaped. There was nothing when we returned. There was no furniture or utensils in the house. There were no kitchen utensils as well. We ran without taking anything with us. We have nothing now." This was one of several quotes like this where they referred to like down to the tiniest detail. There was no utensils left. We literally have nothing now, or our house was burned down. So just like a complete wipe of all your material resources. Then kind of cascading into those contextually related losses that followed these losses. This is an example of describing how it's difficult to not have a male partner in that context for a woman. So one woman said, "It's a very big problem if we have to live without male help while our husbands have been kidnapped. Women cannot live alone without men. It's different here in rural Sri Lanka. We are not allowed to talk to or smile at a man who is alone in our village. If we talk to them, then the society will hurt our hearts." That was kind of that a reference to being accused of breaking up a home or maybe being accused of prostitution. It's just not socially appropriate for a widowed woman to connect on any level. And here's a quotation about the elephants. "Elephants would come, they would come to our premises, they would break and eat all these. Houses don't have doors. They would take whatever there is, like patty and coconut, and eat it." So they just described again this sort of middle of the night, very quiet thing that would happen where suddenly there's kind of a trunk coming through the window of your house and this happens. And here's some responses to loss. We don't have much hope, and this is kind of referring to one's own life. And many things we have to get because we have to run our day-to-day life. So there's that focus on the present moment. We don't have many expectations because we have to run our life as it is. We have to eat and buy some reasonable clothes, and that's enough for us because we don't have much expectation, which is kind of one way to cope with that loss. Even those days, we were a little bit richer than now. We have lost everything in the tsunami and war, and now we are in the low-level life. So kind of responding by modifying expectations and staying in the present moment, just dealing with today. And here's one a little bit about needing to forget. So we should get a job and move forward. We think about living better. We have been missing them, the people who were kidnapped, hoping they will be released and come back soon. I have not been expecting their return. We cannot keep thinking like this. We should raise our children, hence we should get some job and have a better living and then find a way to raise children, which kind of sums up of we got to let go and just keep looking forward to the future. This was another situation where we had to be careful and sort of monitor and understand how we were conveying the data. There were alleged kidnappings on both sides for Sinhalese individuals and Tamil individuals perpetrated by both sides of the conflict. So in order to protect our participants in the way that we conveyed this data, we had to make it explicit that we did not ask about which warring party perpetrated any kind of kidnapping, and we don't know. But it was just sort of an interesting kind of political contextual position that we needed to take to ensure that our participants didn't come back with any backlash from anybody from talking with us. Okay, so to wrap all this up, I wanted to talk about what I've been thinking about a lot lately, which is research in vulnerable contexts. So the quotes that I just read to you were collected 3 years ago, but I did not have them translated and transcribed until coming to BYU. So it's only been, I've been kicking around and reading this data, analyzing it, writing it up over the past year. And as I came to really, get to see exactly what was in there, it was very revealing. The research team and I, my colleague and I don't speak Tamil. And so while this data was being collected, we were there and we were sitting in the room or outside. A couple of them were outside. So we were listening, but they weren't translated firsthand. So we picked up bits and pieces of what was there, but we didn't know everything that had been said. And so one of the things that really struck me was how some of the women talked about, they thought maybe we were coming to be like an assistance program. And it was clear that they hadn't fully understood what we were doing there in the terms of research. We hadn't come with an intervention. So they would ask questions like, should I register here? What is this kind of program? What will be done with this information? We had an informed consent kind of procedure for them at the beginning, but again, it was clear in the context with so much vulnerability and so much need that there was a hope that we were doing more there than just kind of looking at their story, So I felt really moved by that and kind of called to question my own position as a researcher. So I wanted to talk about just some of the things that we've outlined in our most recent study that are kind of risks in working with vulnerable populations and what to do about that. So one risk is just obviously an exploitation of the research context. Needing to be really clear about what our intent is as researchers and whether our intent is enough. I've wondered that a lot since coming back from this last study, was just going to gather data and to ask questions justify asking these women to leave their homes for a time and come and maybe have hope of it being more than it was at that moment. Another issue that we had was with incentives. After we returned to the U.S., we had a plan for our incentives, which was the equivalent of $5 US. They were going to be delivered to our participants a few days after the data gathering. And we heard just kind of through the grapevine, because we were relying on several members of the community to dispense those incentives. We heard that there was a threat that some of our people who delivered the incentives were going to go back and tell the women, we gave you that, $5, but there's actually a tax on it. You need to give half of it back, and that they would do it just very willingly and unquestioningly. So to avoid that, we changed our incentive to be $5 worth of household goods and food to kind of reduce the hope that some kind of exploitation would happen after we had left. So that's just one example of, and this is something that happens with vulnerable contexts. This is something that may happen in international contexts when you have heavy reliance on various layers of the community to kind of achieve the research goal. You have to be aware of that. I've talked a little bit about this potential danger for participants, just in revealing things that had happened to them of a traumatic nature because it's so politically charged, because of it happened in this context of a Civil War conflict that went on for a long time, that's still being investigated, that's still a little under debate. So we had to be, again, guarded and pretty cautious about the research questions that we did ask. Then the last one is just asking myself, who am I to tell this story? So I want to call your minds back now to the very beginning of the presentation about how I got involved in this work. I feel really privileged to have been able to follow my opportunities and be able to be involved and be a witness to the context and to hopefully play a role in giving voice to this experience of these women. But I've often reflected on whether my interest and connection with a thesis chair qualifies me or is enough for me to be in a position to tell this story. So I'm thoughtful about this as I think about mentoring students in research and who have interest in vulnerable population, to really consider what is your intent and what should be your intent, and what connection do you have, what connection ought you to have to a context to have such intimate things revealed to you about people's loss and about their lives. So what should we do in response to these things? Be really clear about your intent, not just with yourself, but with your participants. And in my little bit of work with vulnerable participants, it's really clear that informed consent piece has to be so clear, especially when there's a power hierarchy, when there's cultural differences, when the researchers are coming from somewhere else. It's really, really important to have probably multiple consent conversations and to have them be unfolding at multiple times through the research process. And then also being connected enough to the context to protect your participants from exploitation or from other threats based on what you're asking them to tell you. And lastly, this is the one where that's probably hit me the hardest in terms of, I think, gosh, I wish we would have done that, is just to actually have our research be kind of a two-part thing, where our first part of our study was to actually engage the participants on what should we know about your life. We came in with pre-designated interview questions and survey packets, and we kind of told them what we needed to know and what we should know and what should be important from our clinical knowledge, instead of really actively involving the community who has a stake and should have a stake and should have a benefit from the research. So I think we could have done better work had we done more to have them be active stakeholders in the process. So those are my thoughts, and I'm going to end there. And I understand we have some time for Q&A.
As usual, if you have a question, please come to the microphone, because we are filming this. This will get your question on the audio as well as Professor Witting's response. Please just tell us your name, what you're studying, and then ask your question. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Nicole Earnshaw. I'm studying economics. And I was just wondering if in any of your research you touched on education at all, and if you found any correlation between the education of the widows and their responses to their trauma.
So most of the women in our sample did not have a formal education. Part of the reason we used interviewers was because the majority of them could not read. And so, but there was a really heavy focus on education for their children. So that was one theme that came up a lot in our qualitative interviews, is that because of work conflicts and trying to get from one place to another, it was really hard to make sure their children got on the buses, especially in the rural areas. And they weren't super regular when they would come. And they were so consumed with concern of having their kids be educated. And so they very much perceived that as the way up and out, but most of them did not have that themselves.
Hi, I'm Laura, and I'm studying Middle Eastern Studies in Arabic. And I've heard other researchers who've spoken who looked at psychological distress in international communities talk about how difficult it was to diagnose mental illnesses because there's such different cultural norms that symptoms and signs look different. Is that something that you encountered, and how did you deal with that in your research?
That's a really good question. We could have another presentation on that. So, yeah, the measures that we use for post-traumatic stress and anxiety and depression were actually developed in Sri Lanka. Because of that exact issue that you talk about, trauma, in terms of how it manifests behaviorally and physically, is very different in Eastern and Western contexts. We obviously talk about it differently and we handle it differently culturally. So it was really important that we use measures that were local. So there was a couple of researchers, Jaya Akrim and Jaya Akrim, that I forget which year they did it, but it was maybe 10 years before this study, did some grounded theory work of their own and came up with indexes and clinical cutoffs for anxiety and depression that were culturally relevant, which, as you might know, in Eastern context, culturally, as far as trauma symptoms go, you have a lot more somatic or bodily kind of sensations. More than having recurrent thoughts about something, you might actually just experience physical pain. There were some studies right after the tsunami that talked about how people felt like they had been hit by the wave physically and just carried pain as a manifestation of the trauma. So it's such an important thing that you bring up. Good question.
My name is Rebecca S. Savage. I study political science and sociology. I spent about 8 months on a research project about truth commissions, focusing on the role of women in them. I believe Sri Lanka actually had one. And so I had a question, given the vulnerability of the population, the concerns that you had about truth-telling and about vulnerability in your experience, what role should that play in post-conflict mechanisms, and kind of what priority should it take, given that it makes women more vulnerable?
Oh, that's such a good question. I'm wrestling with that one. Yeah, I think, I really, really struggle. Because having sat with the women and being there and in their homes and in their communities, the last thing you would ever want to do, especially when you feel like there's not entirely clarity on what's going to be done with their information, even though we've told them the consent process has to be iterative and done more than we would do it in somebody with a shared culture. So the last thing I feel like I want to do is put any of them at risk. At the same time, I've been really appreciative of the work of Hindman that I mentioned and others who have elevated the conversation about women's issues in Sri Lanka to include a very overt feminist lens to address some of these issues. That said, there's still, to my knowledge, in the scholarly literature, there hasn't been a ton of mention or description of these kinds of war crime type issues, simply because it is still unfolding within the country. So, I mean, to answer your question, I don't have one. It's just such this delicate balance of, again, what is my purpose and priority? Am I truth-telling so that I can get a jazzy publication, or and what connection and what stake do I have with the community? I didn't feel personally vested enough in the desires of the participants themselves to expose the full gamut of what they talked about. Their risk, that's the choice that we made with these two papers anyway. and others that we've done, was to be more selective about what we included, just because they're on the other side of the world where we're very removed from the potential consequences of those actions, and so we've been pretty conservative at this point. Yeah, good question.
I am Marcus Vanderholm. I'm an American Studies and Economics major. My question is very similar to the last one, but I'm curious to know, with your scholarship, in addition to elevating the narrative and the conversation surrounding these traumatic experiences in Sri Lanka, have you seen or do you see the potential for direct benefits in the area and in these women's lives of the research that you've done?
Potentially. I mean, the idea is that if we're going to right social injustices of a variety of kinds, including the stigma issues and the war issues, then we have to talk about them and be critical about them. So yes, I mean, I think the answer is that it does hold potential for benefit. The question is, when and how does that benefit unfold? And it frequently can take lots of decades or generations for those changes to happen, but the hope is that they can. And I think there's some evidence of that as well. There are a number of really excellent NGOs and government organizations in Sri Lanka that have done good work in this area. Like I talked about with some of the stigma issues around widowhood, it's not present to the same degree in every region. So I think there is work that's unfolding that's already benefiting, but as we know, the progress on these issues can be slow.
Do you see your research as being a direct benefit to those organizations that are working in the area?
I hope so.
Thank you.
Yeah.